There is a moment in almost every scientific story that feels like relief. It's the moment when the headlines fade, when the diagrams stop changing, when the explanations settle into something stable enough to repeat. It's the moment when we quietly decide that the story is over. This is not a story about something new appearing in the sky. It's a story about what happens after we decide nothing new is happening anymore. Because strangely enough, that decision, the moment of collective understanding, is often the most dangerous part of the entire process. Most discussions begin with discovery. This one begins after resolution, after the object has been named, after the anomaly has been categorized, after the uncertainty has been reduced to something manageable, and after attention moves on. What follows is not ignorance, it's something far more subtle. It's confidence. Confidence that the explanation is good enough. Confidence that whatever didn't quite fit will eventually make sense. Confidence that there is nothing urgent left to watch. And confidence in systems designed to observe the unknown can quietly become a liability. If you followed stories like this before, you already recognize the pattern. Something appears. It doesn't behave exactly as expected. The data is strange, but not strange enough to stop the process. So, we classify it. We compare it to what we already know. We build a working model, and eventually, we stop asking new questions. Not because everything has been answered, but because the answers we have feel sufficient. That's usually where the story ends. But that's not where it actually stops unfolding. What's unsettling is not how often we encounter anomalies. It's how consistently we respond to them in the same way, with relief. Because relief means stability, and stability means we can turn our attention elsewhere. In science, this isn't a failure, it's a survival mechanism. No system can treat every irregularity as a crisis. No field can remain permanently alert without collapsing under its own weight. So, questions are triaged, uncertainty is prioritized, and explanations, even imperfect ones, are embraced if they allow progress to continue. This is how knowledge advances, but it's also how certain kinds of uncertainty become invisible. The moment a phenomenon receives a name, something changes. A label creates familiarity. Familiarity creates distance, and distance lowers the sense of urgency. Once something is understood, it no longer demands constant attention, and that's where the real tension begins. Because understanding in practice often means something very specific. We know enough to stop looking closely, not enough to predict everything, not enough to rule out deeper implications, just enough to move on. There's a quiet assumption embedded in this process, that whatever remains unexplained will stay safely contained within the margins, that the unanswered parts are minor, peripheral, non-threatening. And most of the time, that assumption works until it doesn't. What makes this pattern difficult to notice is that it doesn't feel like neglect. No data is erased, no measurements are ignored. No one says, "This doesn't matter." Instead, the unresolved details are stored under a mental category that feels harmless. We'll come back to this later, but later rarely arrives in the way we imagine, because attention, once redirected, rarely returns with the same intensity. And when it does, the context has often changed. The instruments are more sensitive, the environment is more complex, and the stakes are higher. By then, the original questions no longer sound as urgent, even if they were never truly answered. This is why the most critical moment in many scientific stories isn't the discovery itself. It's the pause that follows explanation, the quiet confidence that settles in, the sense that the anomaly has been handled, that nothing fundamentally new remains to be understood. And this pattern isn't rare. It repeats across decades, across disciplines, across entirely different kinds of phenomena, different data, different technologies, the same response. Because the problem isn't the anomaly, it's the moment we decide it has stopped being one. In the sections that follow, we're not going to focus on a single object. We're not going to build a case around one event or one set of measurements. Instead, we're going to examine the pattern itself, the moment explanations become comfortable, the moment attention fades, and the moment when unresolved questions quietly slip beneath the surface. Not because they were disproven, but because they stopped making us uneasy. And that, more than any single discovery, may be the most important signal of all. To understand why this pattern repeats, we have to look at how scientific certainty is actually built. Not in theory, but in practice. Science doesn't move forward by staying uncertain forever. It advances by stabilizing questions long enough to work with them. A phenomenon appears, it's observed, measured, compared. Then comes the most important step: classification. Once something fits into an existing framework, it becomes usable. It can be discussed, modeled, referenced, and most importantly, it can stop demanding constant attention. This isn't negligence, it's efficiency. Without this process, science would stall under the weight of endless ambiguity. Every unanswered question would compete for urgency. Every irregularity would feel equally important. So the system does what it must do to survive. It narrows focus, it prioritizes, and it treats explanations not as final truths, but as working structures. The problem begins when those structures feel too complete, because once a model explains enough of the observed behavior, something subtle happens. The remaining inconsistencies stop feeling urgent. They don't disappear, they're documented, acknowledged, but they're no longer central to the conversation. They're framed as edge cases, measurement noise, future work. And in many cases, that framing is justified. Most irregularities really do resolve themselves with better data or improved tools, but not all of them. Some inconsistencies persist quietly. They don't grow dramatic enough to demand attention. They don't violate expectations loudly. They simply remain. This is where the distinction between understood and resolved becomes dangerously thin. Because understood often means something very specific. We know where this fits, not why it behaves the way it does in every case, not what it might imply under different conditions, just where it belongs. And once something belongs somewhere, it stops being watched with the same intensity. The questions change. Instead of asking, "What is this?" we begin asking, "How does this fit within what we already know?" That shift feels reasonable, but it also quietly reshapes what kinds of answers are allowed. When a phenomenon doesn't fully align with an existing model, the response is rarely rejection. It's accommodation. We adjust parameters, we expand tolerances, we explain away deviations as rare or negligible. And most of the time, that works. The model improves, predictions become more accurate, progress continues. But accommodation has a side effect. It reduces discomfort, and discomfort is often what keeps attention sharp. Once a system becomes comfortable with an explanation, it stops testing it as aggressively. Not because scientists stop being curious, but because curiosity is guided by incentives, funding, peer attention, practical applications. Questions that appear mostly solved naturally fall in priority. They don't disappear, they just move to the background. This is why so many scientific surprises don't come from entirely new discoveries. They come from old data re-examined under a different lens, from patterns that were visible but not emphasized, from anomalies that were acknowledged but not pursued. Not because anyone failed to notice them, but because the system had already decided where to look next. And this decision isn't irrational, it's necessary, but it creates a blind spot, a specific kind of blind spot, one that forms not from ignorance, but from confidence. The confidence that says, "We understand this well enough." That phrase is rarely spoken out loud, but it guides countless decisions. Which measurements get repeated, which instruments are refined, which questions are considered productive. Over time, this confidence becomes structural. Entire fields organize around shared assumptions, shared definitions, shared boundaries. And within those boundaries, progress accelerates. But outside them, uncertainty accumulates, quietly, unnoticed, because no one is actively looking there anymore. This is why some of the most consequential scientific shifts don't begin with discovery. They begin with reconsideration, with someone asking a question that feels almost unnecessary. Why did we stop paying attention to this? Why did we decide this was settled? And what assumptions were we protecting when we made that decision? These questions don't imply failure, they imply maturity. Because every robust system, scientific or otherwise, develops habits. And habits, by definition, trade flexibility for efficiency. The danger isn't that science explains too much. It's that explanations become comfortable enough to stop feeling provisional. And when that happens, anomalies don't disappear. They wait. They remain embedded in data sets, archived in papers, footnoted in conclusions, present but inactive. Until conditions change, until new tools make them visible again, or until a different context gives them new meaning. And when that moment arrives, the question is rarely, why didn't we see this? It's almost always, why did we stop looking? At first, these unresolved details don't look important. They don't trigger alarms. They don't contradict the core explanation strongly enough to demand revision. In fact, that's exactly why they persist. They exist in a narrow space where they are visible, documented, and yet easy to set aside. Not because they are invisible, but because they are inconvenient to prioritize. This is where anomalies begin to change their role. They are no longer discoveries. They become background noise, small deviations that don't scale into a crisis, measurements that fall just outside expectation, but not far enough to force a response. And because they don't demand immediate action, they slowly lose narrative weight. They remain in the data, but they stop shaping the story. What makes this especially difficult to recognize is that nothing appears to be going wrong. The models still work. Predictions remain accurate within acceptable margins. The system continues to function. From the outside, everything looks stable. And stability, especially in complex systems, creates trust. So, when an anomaly refuses to disappear but also refuses to escalate, it enters a kind of observational limbo. It's acknowledged, referenced occasionally, sometimes mentioned in footnotes or side discussions, but rarely brought back to the center. Not because it has been resolved, but because it has been absorbed. This absorption process is subtle. The anomaly doesn't get erased. Instead, it gets reframed. Its significance is reduced. Its impact is localized. It becomes something that doesn't affect the bigger picture. And once that framing takes hold, attention shifts elsewhere. This is where the story usually becomes quiet, because nothing dramatic happens next. There is no sudden failure, no clear contradiction, no moment that forces a decision. Just a gradual widening gap between what the model explains well and what it explains poorly but tolerates. Over time, this gap becomes normalized. The anomaly stops feeling anomalous. It becomes part of the environment. And once that happens, it stops being watched with the same intensity as the system around it evolves. New instruments come online, detection thresholds improve, data volume increases, but the underlying assumptions remain largely unchanged. The questions being asked are still shaped by earlier conclusions. This is how blind spots form, not through ignorance, but through continuity, because continuity feels safe. When something has been observed repeatedly without immediate consequence, the absence of escalation becomes its own form of reassurance. The anomaly didn't lead to failure last time, or the time before that, so it gradually loses its perceived risk. But repetition does not equal understanding, and familiarity does not equal resolution. The danger here isn't that anomalies are ignored. It's that they are contextualized in ways that prevent them from being re-examined under new conditions. Once a phenomenon is categorized, future observations are filtered through that category. The question is no longer, what is this telling us? But how does this fit into what we already decided? This shift is almost impossible to notice while it's happening because it doesn't feel like neglect. It feels like progress. And this is the point where certain objects, measurements, or events begin to carry a disproportionate amount of interpretive weight. Not because they are unique, but because they arrive at the wrong time, or under the wrong assumptions, or into a framework that is no longer flexible enough to absorb them without distortion. This is where things begin to feel slightly off, not dramatically wrong, just unresolved. The anomaly doesn't violate known laws. It doesn't force a rewrite. It simply behaves in ways that require too many small exceptions, too many adjustments, too many explanations that work individually, but feel strained collectively. And because no single inconsistency is decisive, none of them are pursued with urgency. Instead, they accumulate, quietly, over years, sometimes decades, each one small enough to tolerate, each one insufficient on its own. But together, they form a pattern that only becomes visible in retrospect. This is why so many scientific reassessments begin with a strange realization. The clues were always there. The data was not missing. The observations were not hidden. They were simply not central. They existed at the edges of attention, and edges are where systems are least likely to look unless forced. What makes this especially relevant is that some anomalies are not passive. They are dynamic. They evolve. They respond to context. And when they are treated as static or fully understood, their significance can change without notice. At that point, the original classification no longer captures what is actually happening. But because the label remains, the sense of understanding remains with it. This is the quiet danger of premature resolution. Not that it produces incorrect answers, but that it prevents better questions from being asked. And once a system stops asking better questions, it becomes increasingly confident in answers that are no longer being tested. That confidence doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually, through repetition, through routine, through the absence of surprise, until one day the context shifts, and what once seemed marginal suddenly feels central, not because the anomaly changed overnight, but because the assumptions surrounding it finally did. Once you learn to recognize this cycle, you start seeing it across completely different domains. The details change, the instruments change, the vocabulary changes, but the rhythm stays remarkably consistent. An observation appears that doesn't quite fit. The first phase is curiosity and urgency, the feeling that something has arrived that we need to account for. The second phase is stabilization, a rush to classify, compare, translate the unknown into something we can work with. And the third phase is the most quiet, the most seductive, and often the most decisive, the phase where the story becomes familiar enough to stop feeling unfinished. What makes this cycle so effective is that it usually produces real progress. It creates usable knowledge. It turns confusion into a framework. It allows prediction, planning, engineering, and broader understanding. But the same mechanism that produces progress also produces a specific kind of blindness, because progress has a cost. It forces complexity to compress into something that can be carried forward. And compression always discards something, not in a dishonest way, in a practical way. The system keeps what is necessary for function, and it sets aside what is not immediately useful. The problem is that not immediately useful is not the same as not important, and over time those two ideas become dangerously easy to confuse. This is why so many scientific narratives feel finished long before they are complete. A model can be strong enough to operate with, and still incomplete in ways that matter. A classification can be accurate enough to publish, and still hide the most consequential questions. A conclusion can be true in the narrowest sense, and still mislead in the broader sense because it creates emotional closure. And once closure sets in, attention begins to decay. The cycle moves on, the anomaly becomes a chapter that feels resolved, and whatever didn't quite fit is quietly transferred into the background where it can remain for years without forcing a confrontation. Here is the uncomfortable part. This is not rare. It's not an exception. It's the normal outcome of any system that has to make decisions under uncertainty. And it becomes even more pronounced when the phenomenon is hard to observe directly, when the data sets are imperfect, when measurements are expensive, or when the environment itself changes faster than our models can. In those conditions, the temptation to treat a working explanation as a finished one becomes almost irresistible because it feels responsible. It feels like discipline. It feels like not overreacting. And in many cases, it truly is the right choice. But every time we make that choice, we quietly accept a trade. Speed and stability now, deeper understanding later. The risk is that later does not arrive on schedule. That's why reassessments often feel like surprises, even when they shouldn't. People react as if something new has been discovered, when what actually happened is that something old stopped being ignored. The data didn't suddenly appear. The anomaly didn't suddenly become real. The context shifted, the tools improved, and the same deviation that once seemed tolerable began to look suspicious. Not because it grew, but because it was finally seen against a wider landscape. And this is one of the most important facts about scientific uncertainty. It isn't just about what we don't know. It's about what we think we've already handled and therefore stop testing. If you want to understand why certain anomalies keep returning, why they keep resurfacing in public attention, in scientific debate, and in new data sets, you have to look at the role of forgetting. Not forgetting as negligence, but forgetting as a natural byproduct of moving forward. Entire fields develop momentum. Research priorities shift. Funding moves. New crises emerge. And what was once interesting but not urgent becomes settled enough, until a new observation forces the old question back into the light. The story returns not because the universe is repeating itself, but because our attention has patterns, and those patterns are predictable. This is the point where the question changes. Instead of asking, what is the anomaly, we begin asking, what does it reveal about the limits of our current framework? That second question is harder because it doesn't offer a single target. It points back at the system. It implies that the most important part of the story might not be the phenomenon at all, but the way we interpret it. And that is exactly why these stories can feel endlessly repeatable without becoming redundant. The object remains the same, but the lens keeps changing. And when the lens changes, the meaning changes with it. Now, there is a reason some names keep resurfacing in this space. Not because they are guaranteed to represent a threat, and not because they prove anything on their own, but because they arrive at moments when our frameworks are already stretched. They become reference points, not in the sense of this is the answer, but in the sense of this is where the story stopped feeling finished. They sit at the edge of classification, the edge of confidence, the edge of language. They become reminders that a label is not a conclusion. And when a system is tired, when attention is dispersed, when the desire for closure is high, those edge cases are exactly where premature certainty can do the most damage. So, if you've ever wondered why certain anomalies never truly go away, why they reappear in different forms, in different discussions, with different interpretations, the explanation may be simpler than it seems. They aren't returning because they were never seen. They're returning because they were seen, named, and then emotionally closed. And closure is not the same as understanding. Closure simply means we stopped asking better questions. And that is the uncomfortable pattern we're going to follow, step by step. Not to sensationalize it, but to see it clearly. Because once you see the cycle, you start noticing where it breaks. You start noticing where the exceptions accumulate. You start noticing where the language begins to strain. And when that happens, the story stops being about one anomaly, or one object, or one data set. It becomes about the narrow region where our confidence outpaces our verification. That region is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. But it's where the most meaningful surprises tend to grow. Now we can move from the abstract pattern to what it looks like in real life, because the cycle only becomes obvious when you watch how it unfolds in the details. The most revealing examples are rarely the ones that explode into immediate crisis. They're the ones that drift through the system quietly, leaving behind a trail of almost and not quite, and then getting folded into routine. The first thing that usually happens is a burst of attention. An observation is logged, a signal is reported, an object is tracked, a set of readings refuses to behave. People talk about it. Analysts compare it to what came before. A handful of explanations become popular, not because they are proven, but because they reduce uncertainty quickly. And then the second thing happens. Almost without anyone noticing, the story compresses. The complicated parts get pushed to the side. The headline becomes simpler than the data set. The conclusion becomes cleaner than the method. And what remains is a version of events that feels stable enough to repeat. In that compressed version, the anomaly is no longer a living question. It becomes a solved puzzle, even if the solution is provisional. You can see this in the language people use. Early on, everything is conditional. Could, might, suggests, uncertain, needs follow-up. Later, the conditional language fades. It is replaced by summaries. Likely, consistent with, explained by, within expected parameters. Again, this shift is not dishonest. It's what happens when knowledge is packaged to move through institutions. But the packaging changes the emotional texture. Once a story can be summarized cleanly, it begins to feel complete. And completeness is a powerful drug in any system built on uncertainty. This is why the most important details are often the ones that resist summarization, the ones that force awkward footnotes, the ones that require the speaker to slow down and say, "But there's one more thing." And those details rarely dominate the narrative because they don't fit into a neat conclusion. They demand time. They demand patience. And patience is expensive in a world that constantly demands closure. So they drift into the margins, and the story continues forward without them, as if they were optional. If you listen carefully to how this happens, you begin to notice a strange inversion. The more complex the phenomenon is, the more attractive it becomes to treat the first workable explanation as the final one. Not because anyone wants to be lazy, but because complexity is exhausting. It asks too much. It keeps the mind in a state of unfinished business. And unfinished business is uncomfortable, especially when everything else in the world is competing for attention. So the system naturally rewards whatever provides the cleanest sense of resolution, even if that resolution comes with small caveats that never quite disappear. This is where the false calm sets in. Not the calm of truth, but the calm of narrative closure. It feels like the storm has passed. The anomaly is filed. The debate cools. People move on. And because nothing visibly breaks, that calm feels justified. The system interprets the absence of immediate consequence as evidence that the phenomenon was never truly dangerous, never truly urgent, never truly worth extended attention. But the absence of visible consequence doesn't mean the underlying uncertainty was resolved. It only means the system survived without confronting it. And survival is not proof of understanding. It's just proof that the edge case didn't collide with the core assumptions hard enough to cause damage yet. At this point, something subtle begins to happen in the background. The anomaly becomes a reference, a case study, a line in a review paper, a data point in a larger discussion. Its sharpness fades, its strangeness becomes familiar, and familiarity changes the way new evidence is interpreted. Future observations that might have reignited the original question are now processed through the old label. They are not treated as fresh signals. They are treated as supporting evidence for a story that was already written. This is one of the quietest ways premature certainty reinforces itself. Once a narrative becomes canonical, the data becomes a confirmation exercise. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but structurally. The system begins to ask not, "What is this telling us?" but "How does this fit the story we already agreed on?" And then sometimes the universe does something unhelpful. It produces a new observation that is similar enough to be linked, but different enough to feel uncomfortable. Not different enough to be unrecognizable, different enough to be inconvenient. Those are the moments where the old framework begins to strain. The language starts to wobble. People add qualifiers. They propose minor adjustments. They create new subcategories. They attempt to absorb the deviation without reopening the original question. Because reopening the original question is costly, it implies that the closure was premature. It implies that time and attention were misallocated. It implies that the story was never as complete as it sounded. And systems, like people, don't enjoy admitting that. This is why certain anomalies become recurring characters in the public imagination. Not because they are the same object returning, but because they occupy the same conceptual space. The space where classification is possible, but confidence feels fragile. The space where the data is good enough to make claims, but not good enough to erase ambiguity. The space where the simplest explanation works, but works with too many small exceptions. When something lives in that space, it becomes a kind of mirror. Each time it reappears in discussion, it reflects not just what we observed, but what we assumed. It reveals how quickly we want a story to end. It reveals how easily good enough becomes done. And this is exactly where names start to matter, not as proof, not as evidence of threat, but as markers of our psychological timeline. Some names become shorthand for the moment the story stopped feeling comfortable. They become anchors in memory, points people return to when a new dataset arrives, or when a new measurement refuses to behave. They are invoked not because they solve the mystery, but because they remind us where the mystery was supposedly solved before. They are reminders of closure, and that's why they are so hard to let go of. A name is not just a label. A name is a declaration that something has been placed inside a known category. When that declaration starts to look shaky, the name becomes a warning sign. So, in the next stage of this story, we're going to do something that most discussions avoid. We're going to look at what happens after the label is applied, after the initial excitement fades, after the story becomes repeatable. We're going to focus on the small details that never fully settled, the ones that were easy to dismiss one at a time, but become unsettling when you line them up. Not as a conspiracy, not as a failure, as a pattern. And once you see that pattern clearly, you start to understand why certain anomalies don't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. They only need to persist long enough for our certainty to harden around them. Let's take one anchor case, not as a headline, and not as a villain, but as a clean example of how premature closure forms in real time. The details of the object are less important than the sequence of reactions it triggers, because what we're studying here is not the sky. We're studying how quickly a system becomes satisfied with a story. In the beginning, the observation looks ordinary enough to categorize. It enters the conversation with a familiar silhouette, an object with a trackable path, measurable brightness, a set of properties that resemble things we've cataloged before. The first interpretations arrive quickly because they have to. A system that can't classify cannot prioritize, and prioritization is survival. So the early language tends to be practical, stabilizing, and reassuring. It fits somewhere. It behaves mostly as expected. There are known categories for things like this. Then the first oddities appear. Not enough to break the label, but enough to require explanation. The object's behavior seems to lean against the boundaries of the category, not in a single dramatic way, in a series of small frictions. The first friction is usually variability, changes that are real, measurable, but hard to summarize. The object might brighten or dim in a way that doesn't align neatly with the simplest assumptions, or its signature might suggest more complexity than the label implies. The second friction is often trajectory related. Not that the math fails, but that the behavior invites too many fine but statements. Fine, but why does it behave like that at this distance? Fine, but why does the pattern repeat with that timing? Fine, but why does the signal feel unusually structured for what we're calling it? These are not impossibilities. They are inconveniences. An inconvenience is exactly where the cycle grows, because each inconvenience can be explained away in isolation. You can always propose a plausible mechanism. You can always adjust a parameter. You can always add a caveat. And if you do that one detail at a time, the story remains stable enough to keep moving forward. Here is the critical point. The system doesn't need the explanation to be perfect. It needs it to be socially and operationally sufficient. It needs enough coherence to pass through review, through conversation, through broader summary. Once that happens, the story becomes portable. It can be repeated without rebuilding the entire argument. And portability is what creates closure. Once an explanation can be summarized in a clean sentence, it begins to feel like a resolved question, even if it is still surrounded by unresolved behavior. This is why the most consequential uncertainties often survive as footnotes. Not because anyone is hiding them, but because footnotes are where complexity goes when the narrative needs to remain usable. Now, watch what happens next. The attention that once felt sharp starts to diffuse. The object becomes familiar. Discussions that once revolved around what is happening turn into discussions about what else can we learn, assuming the classification is correct. The frame shifts. And once the frame shifts, the oddities stop being treated as central. They become interesting, worth monitoring, requires further study. All reasonable phrases, all true in a narrow sense. But they also function as emotional sedatives. They reduce urgency without reducing uncertainty. They signal that the story is under control, and control, even when it is partially symbolic, changes how much attention an anomaly receives. This is the phase where the most important details begin to disappear, not from the data, but from the narrative. Because the narrative is what most people remember. The dataset can remain perfectly intact, while the story that sits on top of it becomes smoother and less demanding. The object is now something you can mention without pausing. Its name, its category, its expected behavior, it becomes shorthand. And shorthand is a sign of closure. The more quickly you can name something, the more you feel you understand it. But naming is not understanding. Naming is a form of mental compression. It is how we keep the world manageable. And when the world refuses to remain manageable, naming becomes the first place the strain shows. This is why, in discussions like this, certain names become magnetic. Not because the name itself contains truth, but because the name becomes attached to a moment of cognitive discomfort, a moment when the category felt adequate, and yet the behavior kept pressing against it, a moment when people thought the story had ended, but the data kept whispering that it hadn't. This is one of the reasons objects like 3i Atlas keep resurfacing in conversation, not as proof, not as a threat by default, as a marker and index of the moment when closure began to feel premature. The name becomes a waypoint in the collective memory of uncertainty. It becomes a reminder of a story that was packaged too soon. When you re-examine an anchor case with this lens, you start to notice how the strongest claims are often not the most interesting part. The interesting part is the pattern of small, unresolved details that remain consistent even as explanations change. Because explanations can rotate without resolving the underlying friction. One year, the oddity is dismissed as measurement limitations. Another year, it becomes an edge effect of the modeling assumptions. Another year, it is attributed to environmental noise, or to a rare but known mechanism. None of those explanations have to be wrong. The problem is that the oddity persists through them. It survives the turnover of narratives, and that survival is meaningful. It suggests that the anomaly is not a single misunderstanding. It is a signal of a mismatch between behavior and framework. This is the moment where a careful storyteller does something most discussions avoid. Instead of escalating the fear, they slow down and line up the details. Not to overwhelm, to clarify. Because fear thrives in vagueness, but insight thrives in sequence. So, we take 2 or 3 of the inconvenient details. Nothing sensational, nothing that demands conspiracy. And we ask a more disciplined question. If these details are independent, why do they cluster around the same kinds of cases? Why do we keep seeing similar frictions at the boundaries of classification? Why do the same categories repeatedly require the same kinds of exceptions? And why do we keep resolving the story emotionally, even when the technical resolution remains incomplete? Once you ask that, the narrative begins to shift. The object stops being the center. The system becomes the center. And this is where the discomfort deepens without becoming theatrical. Because a single anomaly can be dismissed as noise. 2 can be debated. but a repeating pattern across multiple cases suggests something structural. It suggests that our frameworks, useful as they are optimized for what we have already seen, not for what we are about to see. They are excellent at absorbing the familiar. They struggle with the boundary conditions. And it is precisely at those boundary conditions where premature certainty becomes most tempting, because without certainty, the system feels unstable. So, we are going to treat an anchor case the way the system often does not, as an ongoing question, not a closed chapter. We are going to pay attention to what happens after the label is applied, after the public excitement fades, after the summaries become neat. We will look at the specific points where the explanation had to stretch, where the language became more careful, where the caveats multiplied. And then we'll do something even more revealing. We'll compare that behavior to other cases that appear unrelated on the surface, but occupied the same conceptual space. Because if the cycle repeats across different contexts, then the cycle is the story. And if the cycle is the story, then the most important question is not, what was the object? The most important question becomes, what did the object reveal about the moment we decided we were done thinking? Here are the kinds of details that matter most in an anchor case, because they are the ones that survive multiple explanations without fully disappearing. Not the loud contradictions, not the sensational claims, but the recurring frictions that keep showing up at the boundaries of classification. The first is what you could call structured variability. Changes in the signal or behavior that are real and repeatable, but too patterned to be dismissed as random noise and too complex to be summarized cleanly. In a comfortable story, variability is supposed to average out. It's supposed to behave like weather, not like a message. But in these cases, the variability often behaves like a signature consistent enough to notice, inconsistent enough to resist a single tidy cause. The second is what you might call exception stacking. Not one anomaly, but a cluster of small caveats that the explanation requires to stay stable. Each caveat is plausible on its own. Together, they begin to feel like scaffolding. The model still stands, but you start noticing how many supports it needs. And the third detail is interpretive drift. The way the explanation slowly changes over time without ever explicitly reopening the question. The story remains solved in public language, while the technical language becomes increasingly careful, conditional, and fragmented, as if the system is adjusting its confidence without admitting that the original closure was premature. If you line these three up: structured variability, exception stacking, interpretive drift, you start to see why certain cases never fully settle, even when the classification remains officially intact. The case becomes less like a solved puzzle and more like an unresolved edge condition. The object itself doesn't have to be extraordinary for this to happen. What matters is the relationship between behavior and category. When behavior keeps pressing against the edges of the category, the system has two options: either reopen the framework or protect the framework and absorb the friction. Most of the time, it chooses absorption because absorption preserves continuity. It allows work to continue. It avoids the cost of destabilizing assumptions that dozens of other questions depend on. This is where the next phase of the cycle begins, and it's the phase that rarely gets discussed openly because it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels responsible. The system begins to defend the story, not aggressively, not emotionally, but structurally. It defends it by deciding what kinds of questions are productive, what kinds of doubts are reasonable, and what kinds of follow-up are worth the expense. This isn't censorship, it's triage. But triage has consequences. Once a story is treated as settled, the burden of proof shifts. New observations are no longer treated as an opportunity to rethink. They are treated as a challenge that must be integrated without destabilizing the core. The default stance becomes conservation. And conservation is the beginning of premature certainty hardening into policy. You can feel this hardening in the subtle ways people talk. Early on, uncertainty is treated as an open field. Multiple interpretations are entertained, even if they are imperfect. Later, uncertainty becomes a narrow corridor. The only acceptable interpretations are the ones that preserve the existing framework. Everything else is framed as speculative, unhelpful, or unlikely, even when the evidence is incomplete. Again, this can be reasonable. In science, not every possibility deserves equal attention. But when the corridor becomes too narrow too quickly, something important is lost: the capacity to ask better questions. The system becomes skilled at explaining why the anomaly is not a problem, instead of asking what the anomaly might be trying to tell us about the limits of our model. This is the deeper meaning behind the phrase, "we understood it." Understanding in practice often means we stabilized it. We found a story that reduces uncertainty enough to move forward. We found a vocabulary that makes the case discussable without reopening foundational assumptions. We found a level of confidence that allows other work to continue without being constantly interrupted. These are all valuable outcomes, but they come with a hidden trade. The moment we stabilize a story, we begin to protect it. Not because we're afraid of truth, but because we're afraid of instability. Because instability is expensive, it slows progress. It creates debates that do not resolve quickly. It disrupts funding narratives. It complicates engineering decisions. It creates the uncomfortable possibility that a large amount of work rests on assumptions that need revision. So, the system becomes conservative by default, and conservation gradually becomes indistinguishable from certainty. This is why, when you look back at certain famous reassessments, the turning point is rarely a single decisive new measurement. The turning point is often a context shift that makes the old caveats impossible to ignore. A new instrument reduces the ambiguity. A new data set increases the resolution. A new event creates consequences the old model cannot explain away. And suddenly the exception stacking stops feeling like harmless scaffolding. It starts feeling like an unstable structure. The drift that once seemed like normal refinement begins to look like avoidance. And the structured variability that was once treated as noise starts to look like a signature that was never truly accounted for. This is the stage where the story begins to feel frightening in a mature way. Not because it proves anything catastrophic, but because it reveals a weakness in how we manage uncertainty. The weakness is not that we classify. We must classify. The weakness is that we confuse classification with completion. We treat the end of the public narrative as the end of the scientific story. We treat the ability to summarize as the ability to predict. And we treat the absence of immediate consequence as evidence that the unresolved parts are safe to ignore. But the unresolved parts are not necessarily safe. They are simply untested under the conditions that would reveal their meaning. This is why the most unsettling cases are often the ones that sit just below the threshold of drama. They don't crash anything. They don't force emergency response. They don't arrive with a clear countdown. They persist. They accumulate caveats. They drift through interpretations. And they become familiar enough that people stop feeling uneasy right up until a context shift makes the unease unavoidable again. When that happens, it can feel like the universe changed overnight, but it didn't. The only thing that changed was our ability to keep telling the comfortable version of the story. So, when a name like 3i Atlas becomes a recurring reference point, the reason isn't that the name contains a definitive answer. The reason is that it sits at the intersection of these three details. It is the kind of case that generates structured variability, requires exception stacking, and invites interpretive drift, all while remaining visible enough to be discussed. It becomes a cultural shorthand for the feeling that closure happened too soon. And if you follow that feeling rather than the headlines, you begin to see something more important than any single anomaly. You begin to see where our certainty hardens, where our questions narrow, and where the story becomes protected. That is the point we're approaching now. The point where the system stops exploring and starts conserving, and where the most meaningful signals become hardest to hear because the narrative is already done. When a story becomes protected, you can detect it in the kinds of questions that stop being asked. Not because anyone forbids them, and not because people become less intelligent, but because the social and institutional environment begins to reward certain directions and quietly punish others. The punishment is rarely explicit. It's usually friction. It's the feeling that a line of inquiry will consume time without producing publishable clarity, or that it will reopen debates that the field has already decided to move past, or that it will demand resources that could be used elsewhere. And once enough friction accumulates, curiosity doesn't disappear. It reroutes. It takes the path of least resistance, which also happens to be the path that preserves the existing framework. This is why protected stories develop a characteristic shape. They begin to treat uncertainty as a boundary problem rather than a central question. Instead of, what are we missing? The conversation shifts toward, how can we refine what we already have? The goal becomes optimization, not reconsideration, refinement, not reframing. And these are valuable goals. They produce better measurements, better models, better predictions within the established range. But they also reduce the probability that someone will ask the one question that would actually change the story. What if the category itself is too narrow, or the assumptions beneath it are doing too much work? You can hear this shift in the language of acceptable doubt. Early doubt is expansive. Later doubt becomes technical. It stays inside the box. It focuses on parameter values, error bars, calibration, edge cases, instrument limitations. All legitimate, all important. But notice what gets filtered out. Doubt about the framing. Doubt about the classification. Doubt about whether the behavior should be considered a signal rather than an inconvenience. Those kinds of doubts begin to sound unhelpful because they do not lead to immediate resolution. They lead to broader uncertainty, and broader uncertainty is expensive. This is where the system starts to confuse stability with truth. The model remains stable over time, therefore it feels correct. The story remains repeatable, therefore it feels complete. The anomaly hasn't caused obvious consequences, therefore it feels safe. These are understandable inferences. They are also dangerously incomplete. Stability can be a sign of robust understanding, but it can also be a sign that the system has stopped testing itself in the right direction. A story can remain repeatable because it is accurate, or because it is comfortable, and comfort is not a scientific criterion, even though it silently influences what humans choose to do with limited attention. Protected stories also create a certain kind of skepticism that looks healthy on the surface but can become limiting over time. Skepticism is essential. It protects against wild claims. It prevents noise from becoming narrative. But when the dominant story is protected, skepticism can become selective. It becomes more aggressive toward new framings than toward old assumptions. It demands a higher burden of proof for changing the story than for keeping it. That imbalance is not immoral, it's structural, but it matters, because it means the default trajectory of knowledge is conservative, and conservatism can delay recognition of patterns that do not fit cleanly into existing categories. This is why some anomalies, even when they persist, never become central. The system becomes extremely skilled at producing plausible explanations for why they don't matter. The more a story is protected, the more intellectual energy is invested in containment, not in the sense of deception, but in the sense of boundary maintenance. The anomaly is kept at the edges, where it cannot destabilize the core. It is treated as a curiosity, not a challenge. It is acknowledged, not pursued. And the pursuit that would be required to truly resolve it is often too costly to justify unless the anomaly becomes dramatic enough to force the issue. But here's the problem. Some anomalies do not become dramatic until the context changes. Their meaning is dormant. They are not urgent in isolation because urgency depends on consequences, and consequences depend on the environment. A weak signal can become a strong signal when the background noise changes. A minor deviation can become crucial when the system becomes more sensitive. And a tolerable exception can become catastrophic when the infrastructure built on assumptions becomes more fragile. This is where the modern context becomes important, because our context has shifted in a way that makes protected stories riskier than they used to be. We rely on models to operate systems that are tightly coupled and globally connected. We rely on classification to triage risk in environments where small misinterpretations can cascade. We rely on stability because we do not have the luxury of restarting our understanding every time something behaves strangely. And that reliance creates a new kind of vulnerability. Not vulnerability to the anomaly itself, but vulnerability to being wrong quietly for a long time. That is the essence of premature certainty. It is not the sudden collapse of understanding. It is the slow accumulation of untested assumptions beneath a stable narrative. The story remains coherent while the reality it describes drifts into a region the story was never designed to handle. The labels remain while the behavior evolves. The confidence remains while verification thins out. And because nothing breaks immediately, the system interprets its own continuity as proof of correctness. But continuity can simply mean the system hasn't been pushed into the conditions that would reveal its blind spots. This is why, when the blind spot finally becomes visible, it often feels like a shock. People ask, how did we miss this? But the more accurate question is, how did we convince ourselves we were done? The blind spot forms at the moment of closure. It grows during the quiet years of stability. And it becomes undeniable only when a new context forces the anomaly into the center. By then, the narrative feels betrayed, even though the data was honest the entire time. The betrayal wasn't in the measurement, it was in the emotional contract. That closure created the contract that said, this is handled. So, what we're really tracking here is not an object, it's the life cycle of certainty, the point where it becomes useful, the point where it becomes comfortable, and the point where it becomes protected. The reason this matters is that protected stories are not rare edge cases. They are the natural outcome of any system that has to keep moving. And because they are natural, they are invisible until something forces them into the light. And that brings us to the next question, the one that turns this from philosophy into something practical. How do we tell the difference between a stable explanation and a protected story? What signs appear first? What changes in language, in priorities, in the kinds of follow-up that gets funded and pursued? And how many times have we seen those signs already without recognizing what they were pointing to? There are ways to tell the difference between a stable explanation and a protected story, and the signs usually appear long before any dramatic contradiction forces a reset. You can see them in language first. Stable explanations invite questions because they treat uncertainty as fuel. Protected stories allow questions only if the questions do not threaten the frame. The difference is subtle, but you can feel it in the default tone. In a stable explanation, caveats are treated like a roadmap. Here is what we don't know yet. In a protected story, caveats become a shield. Here is why we don't need to worry about what we don't know. It's the same uncertainty, but the emotional posture is different, and posture shapes behavior. The second sign is where effort goes. In a stable explanation, effort is invested in testing the edges of the model, trying to break it, trying to see where it fails, because that is how you learn. In a protected story, effort shifts toward refining the interior. The model becomes something to optimize rather than to challenge. The field becomes excellent at improving precision within an agreed framework, while becoming less interested in tests that would require reframing. Again, this is not laziness, it's a rational use of limited resources. But it is also how blind spots mature. The most valuable tests are often the ones that are hardest to justify, because their outcomes are uncertain and their consequences are destabilizing. The third sign is how exceptions are treated. In stable understanding, exceptions are pursued as clues. In protected stories, exceptions are quarantined. They are placed into special categories: rare events, measurement artifacts, outliers, boundary conditions, and once they are quarantined, they stop threatening the core. Quarantine can be a valid scientific move. Not every anomaly deserves the same attention. But when quarantine becomes the default response, the system begins to treat the unknown as something to contain rather than to understand. The anomaly becomes administratively resolved long before it is scientifically resolved. The fourth sign is interpretive asymmetry. What kinds of evidence are allowed to change the story? In a healthy, stable framework, surprising evidence lowers confidence until the story adapts. In a protected story, surprising evidence often triggers a different response. It raises the burden of proof for change. The anomaly must now be not just suggestive, but overwhelming, because changing the story is considered more costly than keeping it. That cost might be practical engineering decisions, funding, reputations, or it might be simply the cognitive cost of reopening a question that everyone believed was closed. Either way, the asymmetry can become self-reinforcing. The longer a story remains protected, the more expensive it becomes to change it, and the more evidence is required to justify that change. Eventually, only a crisis can do the job. Not because the truth requires crisis, but because the social system does. The fifth sign is what gets summarized for outsiders. In stable science, the public summary tends to reflect uncertainty honestly, because uncertainty is still active in the field. In protected stories, public summaries often become cleaner over time, even as the technical discussion becomes more careful. This creates a split. The public believes the story is finished, while specialists quietly know it is still incomplete. That split is not malicious. It's a communication problem, but it matters because public certainty feeds institutional certainty. Once the outside world treats a story as resolved, the internal pressure to keep it resolved increases. The system becomes invested not just in understanding, but in maintaining credibility. And credibility, in the short term, often looks like closure. If you're listening to discussions around an anomaly, you can sometimes hear all 5 signs in the span of a single conversation. The shift from, "What might this mean?" to, "Here's why it probably doesn't matter." The shift from, "We should test the edges" to, "We should refine the model." The shift from, "This exception is interesting" to, "This exception is an outlier." The shift from "New evidence lowers confidence" to, "New evidence must be extraordinary." The shift from "Our summary reflects uncertainty" to "Our summary removes uncertainty." None of these shifts are inherently wrong. They are signs of a system trying to preserve motion. The danger is what happens when all of them occur too early, before the underlying behavior has truly been accounted for. Now, here's why this matters more now than it did in earlier eras. In the past, premature closure could remain mostly academic. A story could be incomplete, and the consequences of that incompleteness might remain contained inside a field for years. Today, our systems are tightly coupled. We build technology on top of models. We embed assumptions into infrastructure. We rely on predictive frameworks to coordinate logistics, navigation, timing, communication, finance, and defense. In other words, our understanding isn't just a set of ideas. It has become operational, and when understanding becomes operational, uncertainty becomes risk. This is where the scale of the problem changes. You can be wrong in a small way and still suffer large consequences, because the world you are operating is complex and interconnected. A minor deviation can cascade. A rare exception can become common under new conditions. A boundary condition can become central as the environment changes. And a model that was good enough for an earlier era can become dangerously incomplete when the system built on it becomes more sensitive. The frightening part is that none of this requires sudden catastrophe. It can unfold quietly. A few unexpected events, a few unexplained failures, a few almost moments, each one rationalized, each one absorbed, until the pattern becomes visible too late. So, when we say we decided too early that we understood, we are not accusing anyone of arrogance. We are describing a structural reality. Closure is rewarded, continuity is rewarded, stability is rewarded. And in a world that depends on stable models to keep functioning, those rewards can push us towards certainty faster than verification can keep up. That gap between confidence and verification is where the most important surprises accumulate. It is where the next iteration of the story forms. And it is also where certain anomalies, certain names, certain cases keep returning, not because they are the center of reality, but because they sit precisely at that gap, reminding us that a stable narrative can still be incomplete. What turns these protected stories from an academic concern into a real vulnerability is not the anomaly itself, but the timing. Certain moments in history amplify uncertainty without announcing it. Because the world does not change uniformly. Our tools evolve faster than our intuition. Our sensitivity increases faster than our categories. And our dependence on stable interpretation grows faster than our ability to revise it. This creates a mismatch. We begin to see more, while still thinking in frameworks designed to see less. The universe doesn't suddenly become stranger. We simply remove filters that once hid its complexity. This is why periods of technological transition are so revealing. New instruments don't just add data, they change the meaning of existing data. Patterns that once looked like noise become structured. Rare events become statistically visible. Edge cases move inward, and phenomena that were previously tolerable exceptions start to cluster in ways that feel uncomfortable. Not because something fundamentally new has appeared, but because the resolution of observation has crossed a threshold where older explanations begin to fray. The danger here is subtle. If a story has already been emotionally closed, the new information is forced to conform to it rather than challenge it. The story remains stable, while reality quietly outgrows it. This is the context in which certain anomalies become unavoidable reference points. They are not special because they are unique, but because they persist across observational regimes. They appear crude at first, then more detailed, then increasingly structured as tools improve, and at each stage, the system tries to absorb them using the same narrative scaffolding. This works until it doesn't. The explanation stretches, the language becomes more careful, the caveats multiply, and yet the story remains publicly settled. That is the moment where names like 3i Atlas begin to matter, not as proof of anything extraordinary, but as indicators that the interpretive load has exceeded what the framework was designed to carry. What makes this especially dangerous is that our modern systems are built to trust the narrative layer. We don't interact directly with raw data. We interact with summaries, classifications, alerts, models, predictions. These abstractions are essential. Without them, complexity would be unmanageable. But abstractions depend on assumptions, and assumptions are only safe when they are continuously tested against reality. When testing slows down and confidence remains high, the abstraction becomes brittle. It continues to function until it encounters a condition it cannot gracefully handle. And because everything downstream depends on it, the consequences propagate. This is why anomalies that persist quietly can be more threatening than anomalies that arrive dramatically. Dramatic anomalies force attention. They break narratives immediately. Quiet anomalies do something more insidious. They coexist with the model long enough for infrastructure to be built on top of the assumption that they are harmless. By the time their significance becomes clear, they are no longer isolated curiosities. They are embedded in systems that rely on their supposed predictability. And changing the story at that point is no longer just an intellectual exercise. It becomes operationally disruptive. That raises the cost of reevaluation even further, reinforcing the tendency to delay it. You can see this feedback loop clearly in how new observations are treated during periods of rapid change. Early on, there is excitement and openness. Then comes consolidation. Then, as dependence increases, caution hardens into conservatism. The system becomes extremely good at explaining why anomalies are unlikely to matter, because admitting that they might matter would imply that the foundation is less stable than assumed. Again, this is not about denial, it is about risk management. But risk management can fail when it is based on outdated assumptions, especially when the environment has shifted faster than the model. This is the quiet irony of progress. The better our instruments become, the more dangerous premature certainty grows. Increased sensitivity does not just reveal more detail, it reduces the margin for error. When we could only see vaguely, rough explanations were sufficient. When we can see precisely, rough explanations can mislead. The same classification that once provided clarity can now obscure meaning because it compresses behavior that should be treated as distinct. The system keeps using the old map, even as the territory becomes more detailed, and maps that are too coarse do not fail loudly. They fail by omission. This is why revisiting old cases under new conditions often feels unsettling. The object hasn't changed, but our relationship to it has. What once seemed distant now feels uncomfortably close. What once seemed rare now feels statistically plausible. What once felt like noise now appears patterned. And because the story was already closed, these changes feel like surprises rather than natural consequences of improved observation. The shock is not in the data. It is in the realization that the data was always pointing here, and we simply lacked the context to interpret it fully. At this stage, the most important question is no longer whether a particular anomaly represents a threat. That question is too narrow. The deeper question is whether our system of interpretation can adapt quickly enough to keep pace with what our tools are revealing. Can we reopen stories without waiting for crisis? Can we treat closure as provisional rather than final? Can we recognize the signs of protected narratives early enough to prevent them from becoming brittle? These are not questions about one object or one data set. They are questions about how we manage uncertainty in a world where uncertainty is becoming more visible, not less. This is why the phrase, "we decided too early that we understood," carries so much weight. It is not a judgment. It is a diagnosis. It describes a moment when confidence outpaced verification, when narrative stability replaced curiosity, and when the cost of reopening questions began to feel higher than the cost of being wrong quietly. That trade may have been reasonable at the time, but conditions change. And when they do, the stories we protected begin to reveal their limits, not through catastrophe, but through accumulation, through repeated near misses, through persistent edge cases, through names that refuse to disappear because they mark the point where closure first felt premature. As we move forward, the challenge is not to abandon classification or certainty altogether. That would be paralysis. The challenge is to recognize where certainty has hardened into something defensive, where explanations have stopped evolving at the same rate as observation, and where the comfort of a finished story is masking the need for deeper revision. Because the most dangerous errors are not the ones we argue about loudly. They are the ones we quietly agree are no longer worth discussing. At some point, every system that tries to understand reality runs into the same problem. Certainty is always temporary, but the world demands decisions as if certainty were permanent. We cannot wait for perfect knowledge before acting. We have to build, navigate, predict, coordinate, and protect ourselves using models that are inevitably incomplete. That isn't a flaw in science. It's a condition of being human in a complex universe. The mistake is not using imperfect models. The mistake is forgetting that they are imperfect once they start working well enough to feel comfortable. This is why the healthiest form of confidence is not the kind that claims final answers. It's the kind that stays willing to reopen questions without needing a crisis as permission. It's the kind that treats closure as a tool, not as a conclusion. In other words, it's confidence that remains paired with verification. When those two stay together, progress remains stable without becoming brittle. When they separate, the system begins to drift into a quiet danger. It continues functioning, while the distance between the narrative and the territory slowly grows. If there is a single lesson that keeps repeating in stories like this, it is that interpretation should never be more rigid than observation. The moment the story becomes more fixed than the data, the story stops being a description and starts becoming a filter. And filters don't just remove noise, they remove information, they remove discomfort, they remove questions. That can be useful for a while, because too much discomfort can paralyze a system. But over time, removing discomfort also removes sensitivity to early warning signs. It makes the system less responsive to subtle shifts. And in a world where small deviations can accumulate into meaningful change, responsiveness matters more than certainty. This is why certain anomalies function like stress tests, not because they prove that the universe is hostile, and not because they guarantee a hidden threat, but because they reveal where our frameworks become rigid. They reveal where classification becomes closure. They reveal where a stable narrative begins to conserve itself. And when you see that, you begin to understand why these anomalies keep returning in our attention. They return because they mark the edges of our understanding. They are reminders that the edge exists, and that we have a habit of pretending the edge is farther away than it is. The uncomfortable truth is that we will always be living on the edge of incomplete understanding. The only thing that changes is how honestly we acknowledge it. In earlier eras, we could afford to let certain questions remain half-resolved because the operational consequences were limited. Today, the operational layer is everywhere. Our models run inside the systems we depend on, and those systems are increasingly sensitive to small errors. That doesn't mean we are doomed. It means we have to treat interpretation as an ongoing process, not a finished product. We have to become comfortable with provisionality without collapsing into cynicism. We have to hold two ideas at once. We know a great deal, and we can still be wrong in ways that matter. And this is where the phrase, "we decided too early that we understood," becomes more than a warning. It becomes a discipline. It becomes a way to keep systems honest. Because the goal is not to remain uncertain forever. The goal is to know where certainty is doing work and where it is doing comfort. To know the difference between a stable explanation and a protected story. To notice when caveats are being used as a shield rather than a map. To notice when the questions are narrowing too quickly, when exceptions are being quarantined by default, and when skepticism is becoming selective. These are not signs of failure. They are signs that the system is drifting into conservation, and drift is easiest to correct when it is noticed early. There is a quiet humility in this approach, but it is not weakness. In fact, it is the only kind of strength that scales. A brittle system appears confident until it breaks. A resilient system appears cautious because it is constantly updating. It keeps its stories flexible. It keeps verification close to interpretation. It keeps the cost of reopening questions low enough that it can reopen them without panic. That is how you avoid the worst kind of surprise. The one that arrives not because the universe changed, but because we stopped paying attention to the parts that never fully settled. So, when you hear another story about an anomaly, another name resurfacing, another object returning to the center of debate, it may be worth resisting the urge to ask only the most obvious question. What is it? The more important question might be, what did we assume when we thought we were done? Because that question doesn't just apply to one case. It applies to the way we navigate reality itself. It applies to the way we build knowledge in a world that will always contain more complexity than our stories can hold. And it applies to the quiet region, where certainty becomes comfortable, where comfort becomes closure, and where closure becomes the moment we stop asking better questions. If that region is where the real risk accumulates, then the most responsible thing we can do is not to fear every anomaly and not to dismiss every anomaly, but to treat them as signals about our own limits. To treat them as reminders that understanding is a living thing. It grows, it adapts, it revises, and when we allow it to do that, when we refuse to turn provisional knowledge into protected narrative, we don't become more afraid. We become more aligned with reality, and in the long run, that alignment is the only reliable form of safety we have. At some point, every system that tries to understand reality runs into the same problem. Certainty is always temporary, but the world demands decisions as if certainty were permanent. We cannot wait for perfect knowledge before acting. We have to build, navigate, predict, coordinate, and protect ourselves using models that are inevitably incomplete. That isn't a flaw in science. It's a condition of being human in a complex universe. The mistake is not using imperfect models. The mistake is forgetting that they are imperfect once they start working well enough to feel comfortable. This is why the healthiest form of confidence is not the kind that claims final answers. It's the kind that stays willing to reopen questions without needing a crisis as permission. It's the kind that treats closure as a tool, not as a conclusion. In other words, it's confidence that remains paired with verification. When those two stay together, progress remains stable without becoming brittle. When they separate, the system begins to drift into a quiet danger. It continues functioning while the distance between the narrative and the territory slowly grows. If there is a single lesson that keeps repeating in stories like this, it is that interpretation should never be more rigid than observation. The moment the story becomes more fixed than the data, the story stops being a description and starts becoming a filter. And filters don't just remove noise. They remove information, they remove discomfort, they remove questions. That can be useful for a while, because too much discomfort can paralyze a system. But over time, removing discomfort also removes sensitivity to early warning signs. It makes the system less responsive to subtle shifts. And in a world where small deviations can accumulate into meaningful change, responsiveness matters more than certainty. This is why certain anomalies function like stress tests. Not because they prove that the universe is hostile, and not because they guarantee a hidden threat, but because they reveal where our frameworks become rigid. They reveal where classification becomes closure. They reveal where a stable narrative begins to conserve itself. And when you see that, you begin to understand why these anomalies keep returning in our attention. They return because they mark the edges of our understanding. They are reminders that the edge exists, and that we have a habit of pretending the edge is farther away than it is. The uncomfortable truth is that we will always be living on the edge of incomplete understanding. The only thing that changes is how honestly we acknowledge it. In earlier eras, we could afford to let certain questions remain half-resolved because the operational consequences were limited. Today, the operational layer is everywhere. Our models run inside the systems we depend on, and those systems are increasingly sensitive to small errors. That doesn't mean we are doomed. It means we have to treat interpretation as an ongoing process, not a finished product. We have to become comfortable with provisionality without collapsing into cynicism. We have to hold two ideas at once. We know a great deal, and we can still be wrong in ways that matter. And this is where the phrase, "we decided too early that we understood," becomes more than a warning. It becomes a discipline. It becomes a way to keep systems honest. Because the goal is not to remain uncertain forever. The goal is to know where certainty is doing work and where it is doing comfort. To know the difference between a stable explanation and a protected story. To notice when caveats are being used as a shield rather than a map. To notice when the questions are narrowing too quickly, when exceptions are being quarantined by default, and when skepticism is becoming selective. These are not signs of failure. They are signs that the system is drifting into conservation, and drift is easiest to correct when it is noticed early. There is a quiet humility in this approach, but it is not weakness. In fact, it is the only kind of strength that scales. A brittle system appears confident until it breaks. A resilient system appears cautious because it is constantly updating. It keeps its stories flexible. It keeps verification close to interpretation. It keeps the cost of reopening questions low enough that it can reopen them without panic. That is how you avoid the worst kind of surprise. The one that arrives not because the universe changed, but because we stopped paying attention to the parts that never fully settled. So, when you hear another story about an anomaly, another name resurfacing, another object returning to the center of debate, it may be worth resisting the urge to ask only the most obvious question. What is it? The more important question might be, what did we assume when we thought we were done? Because that question doesn't just apply to one case. It applies to the way we navigate reality itself. It applies to the way we build knowledge in a world that will always contain more complexity than our stories can hold. And it applies to the quiet region where certainty becomes comfortable, where comfort becomes closure, and where closure becomes the moment we stop asking better questions. If that region is where the real risk accumulates, then the most responsible thing we can do is not to fear every anomaly and not to dismiss every anomaly, but to treat them as signals about our own limits. To treat them as reminders that understanding is a living thing. It grows, it adapts, it revises. And when we allow it to do that, when we refuse to turn provisional knowledge into protected narrative, we don't become more afraid. We become more aligned with reality. And in the long run, that alignment is the only reliable form of safety we have. In the end, the most unsettling part of this story isn't any single object, any single anomaly, or any single data set. It's the realization that our greatest vulnerability is not what we don't know, but what we stop checking once we think we know enough. The moment a story becomes comfortable, it becomes easier to repeat than to revise. And repetition can look like truth, even when it's only habit. That's the quiet trap of closure. It feels like progress, even when it's just relief. We live in an era where relief is increasingly expensive. Our tools are sharper, our systems are tighter, our dependence on interpretation is deeper. And that means the gap between confidence and verification matters more than it used to, because the consequences of being wrong quietly can spread faster than the process of correcting course. The universe does not need to become hostile for this to matter. It only needs to remain complex while we continue to compress it into stories that feel finished. The reason certain anomalies return, the reason names resurface, the reason old cases refuse to stay buried in footnotes is not that the world is obsessed with mystery, it's that the edge of understanding is not a line, it's a moving boundary. Every time we improve our ability to observe, that boundary shifts. Every time the context changes, it shifts again. And each time it shifts, some part of what we considered settled becomes provisional once more. That is not failure, that is reality. The only question is whether we treat that reality as a threat to stability or as a normal condition of progress. Because the goal was never to eliminate uncertainty. The goal was to keep uncertainty visible where it matters, to keep interpretation flexible enough to follow observation, to keep the cost of reopening questions low enough that we don't need a crisis to do it, and to recognize the signs of protected stories early while the system can still adapt quietly instead of being forced into change violently. If there is one habit worth building, it is the habit of asking better questions at the moment everyone else is ready to stop, not as contrarian performance and not as suspicion for its own sake, but as maintenance, as an act of keeping knowledge honest. Because when a story is truly stable, it can survive questioning, and when a story is protected, questioning is the first thing it quietly resists. So the next time you hear that an anomaly has been explained, it may be worth pausing before you accept the relief. Not to reject the explanation, but to ask what kind of explanation it is. Does it invite continued testing, or does it invite closure? Does it map uncertainty, or does it shield it? Does it make the system more flexible, or does it make it more invested in a finished narrative? Those distinctions are not philosophical. They determine how quickly we adapt when the context shifts again, which it always will. And that may be the most honest conclusion we can reach. Not that the story is over, and not that we are helpless, but that understanding is never a final state. It is a relationship. It is a process that has to be kept alive. When we remember that, anomalies become less like omens and more like reminders. Reminders that the universe will always contain more detail than our categories can hold, and that the most responsible form of confidence is the kind that stays willing to revise. The quiet worry, of course, is that we rarely revise voluntarily. We revise under pressure. We revise when the cost of staying wrong becomes higher than the cost of admitting uncertainty. That is how most systems behave, and it's how most of our stories have unfolded. The hope is not that we become perfect, but that we become earlier. Earlier in noticing drift, earlier in revisiting assumptions, earlier in recognizing when closure has arrived too soon. Because the danger isn't that we are ignorant. The danger is that we can become satisfied at the wrong moment. And if this pattern keeps repeating, If our tools keep improving, our systems keep tightening, and our stories keep closing faster than verification can keep up, then the next surprise will not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It will arrive as something quieter, a series of small deviations that no longer stay at the edge, a series of exceptions that no longer remain rare, a series of almost moments that gradually stop feeling like coincidences. And if that happens, the most important question won't be what appeared, it will be what we decided too early that we understood.